because now my guest is here. George, I'm going to try and pronounce your surname, George, but I apologize if I get it wrong. Mychescu.
Michescu. That's fine.
Ah, so close. And this is why I just call you Dr. George. Dr.
That's
George
right. I've
is
been
a good
called many things, Father.
Dr. George is a good friend and a colleague at a company called Catholic Health International. And just last week, Catholic Health International had an event in Lansing, which I think I may have spoke briefly about last week, but I wanted to get George on to talk to you guys about a few things. Firstly, if you don't mind, George, I'd like to start with Terry Schiavo and the importance of this case and why CHI ran an event last week for Terry.
Well, CHI is a group that aims to transform American healthcare, and in fact, healthcare worldwide and medical education, to be faithful to the principles of the Catholic Church, to be in the charism of St. Padre Pio, who is their patron saint. And we aim to establish this paradigm to bring medicine back to where it should be. And Terry Schiavo is an excellent example of that. We in medicine have come to define end of life as ending of suffering rather than fulfilling of life. And a lot of things become suffering. And unfortunately, suffering is often in the eyes of one's physician or one's beholder rather than in the individual. Terry Schiavo being the example of that. To quote unquote end her suffering, she was starved to death and died of thirst over several agonizing days. And it goes beyond the medical ethics. This was at the wishes of her husband, not her family. And again, that's a larger topic, but the topic at hand is end of life care in medicine. I think we all agree that it is acceptable for extraordinary care to be withheld if it is the patient's desire. So if you're not desirous of being kept alive by extraordinary means, which is very artificial means, of artificial breathing machine, a heart-lung machine, something like that, then it's acceptable to not use those therapies. However, the medical establishment has extended extraordinary to be simple feeding and hydration. So placing food down a feeding tube, water down a feeding tube, has now become defined as extraordinary care, which is not. And that's also contrary to the principles of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is clear that simple nutrition and hydration is not extraordinary care. And the rub becomes, if a plastic feeding tube or tube is placed through the nose into the stomach, does that somehow make it extraordinary? I mean, I don't believe so, and nobody else who's being honest really does. It's simply a different conduit. It's like saying, well, it's extraordinary if you use a fork instead of a spoon. It's very similar to that argument. And my thought experiment is, if we really believe that withholding food and nutrition is compassionate and a humane way to end a person's life, then why don't we use that for capital punishment on death row? In the United States where capital punishment is permitted, why not just simply withhold food and nutrition from the convict until he or she expires? If we believe that's compassionate and a merciful way to end a life, we should be okay with that. And obviously it's preposterous, right? We know that's not at all compassionate or merciful. However, the medical establishment can extend that to make it compassionate and merciful when somebody is in a comatose state and unable to speak for themselves. So our aim is to change that paradigm.
And we'll get to how you're aiming to do that, but just want to focus on Terry a little bit because 20 years ago, almost to the day, this was one of the groundbreaking cases that really blew the door off this conversation and burst it into public life. And you're right to point out Terry's husband wanted to end her life for his own motivations that I don't need to go into, but the family fought against it, and they fought against it very hard because they are Catholics and they wanted to fight for her life. I think President George W. Bush at the time also managed to fight for 5 years to extend her life, but essentially they lost that fight because, as you point out, the medical world doesn't see the value of human life in the same way that the Catholic world does. We would say every single human life is sacred because of Imago Dei. We're made in the image of God, the image and likeness of God, and therefore life should be protected. Whereas the medical world would say, well, if you can't keep yourself alive, then what value do you have to contribute to the given society? We've had a number of stories similar to this on this show over the last few weeks that are happening and years that are happening in the UK right now. So it's still going on. We're still letting the state essentially kill people who they deem unworthy of life. And so Terry's case has been marvelous at highlighting that. Now, CHI hosted an event with Terry's brother and sister and mother, Mary. Very good, wonderful people. I just want to show a few brief photographs of what took place at that event. So here is a mass hosted by Cardinal Burke himself, who was, of course, on the board of CHI, but is also renowned around the world amongst Catholics as a traditionalist, someone who sticks ardently to the faith and doesn't bend to modernity. So here we can see a few pictures of, there's Terry's family right there. They gave a wonderful address after the Mass to a full cathedral in Lansing, which was a pleasure to be a part of. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that we also hosted a lovely dinner with them, and it was a privilege to get to know Terry's family. And there was if you can go down, there was an event that was held in the church hall as well, where there was an art exhibition centered on Terry's life and like a memorial celebration. I'm not sure if they're in that collection. Anyway, I'll put some of those up later. But the point is that every now and then we get one of these cases that sticks out like a sore thumb, where we're recognizing that there's a difference between what the Christian faith teaches on life and what the world teaches on life. And so CHI has stood up and said, well, we want to be a part of making a difference and readjusting that, realigning that. And so, Dr. George, I understand that you're president and CEO of the St. Padre Pio Institute for the Relief of Suffering. And part of that project is a med school that you want to launch to realign this view of life in the medical field.
Yeah, correct, Father. I mean, think about it. The culture of death that exists in the United States and again around the world, abortion, the deaths of 65 million unborn children since 1973 in the United States has been brought about by the ready, willing, and able cooperation of physicians. Euthanasia, the starvation of Terry Schiavo and patients like her, was brought about by the ready, willing, and able cooperation of physicians, because they have strayed from the understanding that all life is sacred, precious, and equally worthy from the moment of conception until the moment of natural death. They have started to make and draw lines about what's worthy, what should be preserved, what suffering should be ended. And life is sometimes defined as suffering wrongly. And if you take this to its extreme, I think Iceland is a good example. The country of Iceland only has 2 people born every year that suffer from Down syndrome, trisomy 21. And you say, well, is it something in the Nordic air, the water, the volcanic activity? No. Iceland universally screens pregnant women for the presence of Down syndrome and aborts each and every single infant or child with that condition. Yeah. So it's not that Iceland has cured Down syndrome. Iceland has exterminated people with Down syndrome. And I think Heinrich Himmler would say, well, that's very efficient. He would be very envious of Iceland's role in this. But Iceland is not that far ahead of other Western societies in its war on the disabled, the unborn disabled, and maybe the born disabled, right? We know that disabled individuals suffer from a lower quality of medical care. There's a case of a child that we know born with trisomy 18. Trisomy 18 is another very serious genetic condition that often results in early mortality, severe disability, and almost universally, the medical establishment advocates to abort children with trisomy 18. In fact, the cause célèbre for the Biden administration, the physician who sued the state of Texas so she could kill her disabled unborn child, and was then hosted at the State of the Union address by President Biden, had a child with trisomy 18. So we know of a case, a friend of CHI, the young lady was pregnant with a child who had a diagnosis of trisomy 18, and they did the life-affirming and courageous method choice of continuing this pregnancy to term, raising this child, even though he has significant medical issues. I think he's now almost 2 years old, and is a joy to his family, and is a testament to the dignity of human life. Again, every life is equally worthy, and that's what the medical establishment has forgotten about, that whether one is disabled, whether one suffers from a medical abnormality, they are not somehow less worthy than a normal, healthy person, to use that very broad term. And it's very easy shorthand to say, well, they're not worthy, so we're not going to spend money on their care. We're going to end their suffering. We're going to terminate this pregnancy. You know, in this enterprise, a lot of euphemisms are used, because euphemisms are very easy to obscure the truth. So we hear things like clumps of cells and embryos and fetuses rather than people and children. And it really doesn't matter what euphemism you use. These are all human lives that we're thinking about. And the honest conversation is that all human life is equally worthy from conception until death.
Thank you for watching my Common Sense Crusade. If you'd like to watch the whole show, you can subscribe to lotuseaters.com for as little as £5 per month, and then you get access to a bank of content as well. My show is 3 p.m. every Thursday. See you there. Deus Vult.